Poetry, or She, is a 2010 South Korean film directed by Chang-dong Lee and starred Jong Hee-yoon, Lee Da-wit, and Hera Kim. I do apologize if I butchered the pronunciation of these names. The film is about an elderly woman who cares for her grandchild and works part-time as a caretaker for an elderly man, who is only slightly older than her. I recently had the sublime pleasure of watching this film, and I was blown away by how I hadn't even heard of this film before discovering it shortly before viewing. The given ratings of the film are, in my opinion, not high enough. This truly is a masterpiece. In this video, I want to say what particularly struck me about this film and what thoughts it prompted in me. However, to be able to do that, I will need to recount several scenes and plots from the film. Now, there will be spoilers ahead, not that the beauty of the film lies in its plot, but nonetheless, I encourage you to see the film before watching this further. You have been warned. The film opens with a view of the river and children playing. Everything seems light and playful. Then we see a body floating motionless downstream, and at once the serious tone of the film is established. The whole film is an extension of these first few scenes. The continual flow of water in the river signifies the remorseless flow of time, which brings with it, eternally, the finitude of those who live in it. The children playing by the riverside enjoy a momentary respite from the fateful current, but their ignorance shelters an even more heinous dread. We find our protagonist first in a hospital. She has an appointment with a doctor, and she relays to him about a prickling sensation in her arm. But that is not what concerns the doctor. Her inability to remember words hints at something much more serious. Indeed, mighty as the mind is over the body, it is also much more fragile. Another death knell in the film. There is not only death to worry about, but also the slow path towards it, dying. Outside the hospital, our protagonist encounters the mother of the dead girl found in the river. We learn later it was a suicide. The mother is beyond herself with grief and anguish, and our protagonist sympathizes from a distance. The mother's sorrow clearly weighs on her, as she later brings it up for discussion with the daughter of the man she cares for. But the daughter does not seem to care much and attends to the day-to-day of her shop. Our protagonist sees a note on a bus stop about a poetry class and walks away from it, saying, "The deadline is already over." Another omen of finitude. At home, music is playing loud and the grandson lies curled up in bed. He seems far away, depressed. A strange and curious thing, but later we will know why. Regardless, the grandson is lazy and callous, perhaps not unlike most of his generation. By the time of the first poetry class, the film has visited themes of death, dying, grief, desperation, indifference, and depression. The protagonist narrowly makes it into the class, even though it was full, closed, and ongoing. Perhaps this is our first good omen, that some things are never completely beyond reach. The poetry teacher, who in the film is a renowned poet in his own right, speaks of poetry as a form of seeing, to really see things as they are. And once you truly see things, then you see beauty. If the doors of perception were cleansed, William Blake wrote, the world would appear as it is, infinite. Our poetry teacher touches a nerve of poetry, though it may seem aloof and didactic. However, the students, including our hero, set to work by mechanically applying this notion. It is perhaps no surprise that this doesn't lead our hero anywhere. Poetry, it seems, is deeper than sight. Shortly thereafter, the true ordeal of the film reveals itself. The young girl who had taken her life had written in her diary of 6 young boys who had repeatedly raped her. Unable to live with herself, she ended everything. It turns out our hero's grandchild is one of the 6. A meeting between all the fathers, with the exception of our hero, takes place to discuss the situation. The school does not want this to become news any more than the parents of the culprits. It becomes decided, rather matter-of-factly, that they would pool together money to pay as restitution for the dead girl's family. In this meeting, only our protagonist shows any kind of emotion. She is so distraught by the news, she leaves the meeting to go look at flowers. A man follows her outside, but he doesn't understand her. They both don't understand each other. It's like our protagonist, even before having written any poem, behaves like a poet. Her response to conflict is to appreciate beauty, and when there is sadness, she lowers herself down to linger with it. Whether men are social engineers, who see people and futures like independent mechanical objects to be manipulated and put together for a specific output, our hero looks at the situation and attempts to posit it in a different light, using the power of metaphor. Like the flower celosia or coxcomb, which, we are told, bears the meaning of shield. A shield that protects us, our protagonist says. The shield is the power of metaphor, elicited by the beauty of the flower, which protects any situation to devolve into a process with only a singular outcome. In the world of poetry, the outcomes are manifold, and metaphor is the poetic judgment capable of reinscribing the old and the same into the new and different. As before, what our hero says falls on deaf ears with the man, who tries to bring her back to continue the business of the meeting. It has to be said that our protagonist, while seeming sometimes aloof and far away, she is not careless of the real world with its norms, customs, and rules. The film does not, I think, advocate for poetry as a kind of escape from the drudgery of the mundane and the world of business. But it does try to show that something more is at stake, and that these structures we take as steadfast norms and safe routines are anything but. In the poetry classes, the students are each brought forward to talk about the things which inspire them, where it is they find beauty or recount a memorable event in their lives. The stories are quite varied, but generally upbeat and optimistic. Beauty for most people seems like something light-hearted and fun. Our protagonist later tells her own story, and she speaks of a memory with her sister, how her sister had dressed her up and that she felt wonderful for being taken care of. The world had never felt so safe under the gaze of a loved one. Her words are particularly descriptive, as if she is setting a scene or narrating a piece of literature, carefully speaking of red drapes and how her sister's face was half obscured by the light. Throughout the film, our hero takes notes, but the words put down here fall flat. They state things matter-of-factly. There is no spirit to her words, even though there is plenty of it in how she carries herself. In this scene, her poetic spirit is expressed in prose, but we learn that her sister is very important to her. Perhaps she identifies the dead girl with her sister. The half-obscured face may suggest a transition of life to death. There is one reason we might think this is the case. In the next scene, right after her talk in the class, our protagonist goes to the bridge where the dead girl had taken her life. Our hero peers down the bridge, down into the abyss, with a certain longing, or perhaps camaraderie. The wind blows her hat off. Startled at first, she soon finds elation in this little event as she sees the hat flying gently down into the water, landing softly as a petal on the river's mild skin. She walks into the countryside, and when it begins to rain, and it is like the rain wakes her up from her poetic reverie, she takes a decision and is full of resolve. She returns directly to the old man who she takes care of and indulges into his desires. Was this sacrifice part of a strategy or a free gift? The worries of money and a settlement with the dead girl's mother is still outstanding. The protagonist asks one of the men for a loan, but it's not possible. Later on, the men convince her to see the dead girl's mother, believing that she, as a woman, could smooth relations between the two parties. Reluctantly, she agrees, and is ferried to the location by car. The man imposes on her the seriousness of the situation, that she must succeed. "Your words hold the key," he declares. Indeed, her words will hold the key, but for which lock? Our protagonist goes to the house but finds it empty. A neighbor informs her that the mother is out in the fields. So our protagonist walks out to the fields. The scene opens with a picture of a creek. The flow of water brings to mind the beginning of the film. How the flow of temporality carries perhaps more forgetfulness than that of memory. But the water and the surroundings are gorgeous, and our old lady visibly enjoys herself. She discovers peaches lying on the ground and picks one up to take a bite. The sweet taste immediately prompts her to bring out her notebook, even as she holds the bitten peach with one hand. The screen is filled for a moment with the writing of her notebook. The apricot throws itself to the ground. It is crushed and trampled for its next life. Her most poetic expression yet. She continues her walk and comes across a woman working by the fields and communicates her experience of all the beauty around her. She even talks about the peaches fallen to the ground. The other woman tells her that the fallen ones are the better tasting ones. The ones still hanging are too immature to eat. Our protagonist agrees enthusiastically and adds it is like the peaches were yearning to enter the next life, to make themselves ready as stepping stones for the next to come. The other woman smiles back at her wild imagination, but perhaps this poetic expression captures the truth about life. Indeed, our protagonist feels like she could sustain her own life just on the sheer beauty of flowers alone. Her mind flows like the river. The other woman reasons that she likes her flowers because she is pretty. A subtle compliment, perhaps, but maybe one must first prepare oneself appropriately to experience beauty, whether it is one's inner character or outer garments. Lastly, they discuss the harvest. We learn the other woman is a realist. If the harvest is good, the prices go down, so that it's never easy living off the earth. There is always struggle. They bid each other goodbye, and our hero returns to the path. As she walks away, she realizes who she has been talking with. That was the mother she was supposed to cajole. Immediately she is overpowered with shame at her own forgetfulness and guilt at her incompetence. Shame is the paradoxical vengeance wrought by responsibility over the things we cannot control, and guilt the paradoxical admission that our very being is at fault for which you must pay a spiritual debt. There is no turning back now for her. As outside observers, our reason counsels us that all the protagonist has to do is to return to the site of failure and communicate her mishap, admit that it was an honest mistake, and then to take things from this sturdy ground. But this is the outside, detached perspective, and it is one that is hardest to find precisely when one is immersed in a dire situation. Here, instinct, feelings, and habits guide our actions first and foremost. And in the aftermath, we sink into the negative and become liars. Throughout the film, our hero goes to visit several sessions of a public poetry cafe. Here, poets and poetry lovers go up on stage and read poetry. Often these are followed by humorous remarks by the hostess, but none more so than a policeman who frequently inserts dirty jokes and acts more like a comedian than a serious poet. Indeed, he looks to be the complete opposite to our protagonist, who is very serious about the art, the beauty, the inspiration, and the labor. So much so that she is being weighted down by it. The policeman, in contrast, seems always cheerful and light. At a dinner after one of these sessions, the policeman is confronted by our protagonist's thoughts about him, namely that he insults poetry and that he sullies beauty with his dirty talk. The policeman is visibly perturbed at first, but quickly switches into his usual cheerfulness and admits that his failures are owed to his poor intelligence and incapacity to handle true beauty. He tries to mediate the situation with offering a drink, saying that intoxication is a prerequisite to fall in love with poetry. An intoxication of some sort, certainly. Later we find the two outside the restaurant. The policeman goes out to have a smoke and finds our protagonist sitting and weeping. At first he asks a series of questions, trying to be his usual cheerful. But after no answers, he slumps down and just sits right next to her in silence. The issue of money flares up again, and the pressure reaches a new level. Our hero goes to the old man she cares for and asks him for the money. "Why should I just give it to you, without reason?" he asks. "Is this blackmail?" "I won't make any excuses," responds our hero. Miraculously, she receives the money and immediately goes to pay her share. She is told that everything with the mother is well and that it's all over now. She asks if it's really over, and one of the men say it's hard to know for sure, but they have done everything they can and the situation looks optimistic. We know, as the audience, that the true reckoning is yet to come. Our protagonist takes her grandson out for pizza and tells him his mother is coming to pick him up the next day. She cleans him and makes him look proper. The whole film has been centered around this issue, and it seems that our protagonist may, with the help of the other parents, resolve the situation in the best possible way, and life can go back to normal. Soon her grandchild will be physically away, and this will allow him to escape punishment for good. Everything our protagonist has done has been to shield her grandson. Then, that very evening, when they are playing badminton together, a car rolls up on the side of the street and two men step out. It is the familiar policeman from the poetry readings, along with his partner. The scene is extremely casual and almost surreal given the suffering this whole issue has brought throughout the film. When for a moment our protagonist tries to free the birdie that got stuck in the tree, the partner takes her grandchild with him into the car, and when our protagonist turns around to continue the game, she sees the cheerful policeman ready with the bat. The grandson and the grandmother exchange a long glance. They both know the game is up. The policeman and the protagonist go on playing badminton in silence. They go on because the game of life goes on. The final shot of our protagonist shows her sitting by the desk and writing incessantly. She overflows with ideas, and they speak to her clearly and distinctly. Was this perhaps what was needed? that justice needed to be served for her to finally let go of the situation that entangled her and brought her so much distress. But we know her problems run deeper than the issue with her grandson. We know the main threads are existential in nature: death, misery, grief, finitude, depression, indifference, and the visceral sense of losing one's own personality even as one lives and breathes. That is a frightening circumstance, losing oneself by virtue of just being. How does one live with this? How can one live with this fearful knowledge? I think then that the crime, the story of her grandson, and all the things that followed functioned as a catalyst for her own poetic awakening, and that only approaching things poetically can teach her acceptance and give her peace. In the final scene of the film, we return to the poetry class and find flowers with a letter on the teacher's pedestal. It is from Miss Yang, our protagonist. All that remains from her is this piece of writing. Curiously, no one else in the class has managed to write a poem. The students cry that it is too difficult. The teacher replies, "It is not difficult to write, but to have the heart to write. That is the difficult bit." Our protagonist always had the heart, but the struggles she had made this clear for her. If she had not struggled so much with writing, she would not have been on the way. And all she needed then was to realize that she was always already on the way. The poetic path had opened itself to her. The remainder of the film has the protagonist read out her poem while past and current scenes are shown. These scenes all show someone has vanished, but also how someone lives on through others, through quirky acts or acts of inspiration. She is no longer there with us, and yet she has never been more with us. At long last she has gained her voice, but this she gained in precisely losing herself. She gained her unique voice in the words we all use daily, words that are interchangeable, common, universal, and general. Exactly here is the creative magic of poetry: to breathe life again into the dead, to take up what is used as a tool, a function, a repetitious mechanism, and boring exchange, and within these stolid structures animate something unique and living, a thought, a memory, or a spirited sense that continues into others, just like the poetry teacher that reads her poem and reanimates her voice in his, to be heard, felt, comprehended, and delighted in by all, anywhere, and any time. The poem our protagonist wrote exemplifies just this duality, this sense of renewal and life through change and decay. Her poem is a reflection into herself through the attempts to speak in the voice of the fallen girl. In giving voice to another, she finds her own, a doubling of herself into the other, into the beyond, reaching out to create life in alien lands. This is the strange dynamic of poetry that I think the film tries to get at. Not that poetry as sight and beauty are false, but these things do not adequately reflect existence with all its pitfalls and contingency. Beauty is rather an invitation to see its ugliness, and poetry is this movement that comes into its own by reaching down into the depths of loss, disgust, banality, and indifference. I'll end with recounting the poem our protagonist wrote. This is from the English subtitles that I had, so likely there will be inadequacies from the original. Nevertheless, here too we may rejoice that something not only is lost but also gained in translation, just as the essence of poetry shines through effortlessly in this remarkable film from the other side of the globe. Agnes' Song. How is it over there? How lonely is it? Is it still glowing red at sunset? Are the birds still singing on the way to the forest? Can you receive the letter I dared not send? Can I convey the confession I dared not make? Will time pass and roses fade? Now it's time to say goodbye. Like the wind that lingers and then goes, just like shadows to promises that never came, to the love sealed till the end. To the grass kissing my weary ankles, and to the tiny footsteps following me, it's time to say goodbye. Now as darkness falls, will a candle be lit again? Here I pray, nobody shall cry, and for you to know how deeply I loved you. The long wait in the middle of a hot summer day, an old path resembling my father's face, even the lonesome wild flower shyly turning away, how deeply I loved, how my heart fluttered at hearing your faint song, I bless you. Before crossing the black river, with my soul's last breath, I am beginning to dream. A bright sunny morning, again I awake, blinded by the light, and meet you standing by me.